Aloha loves, thank you so much for watching. A little background about me, Kaylin808. It comes from, Caitlin is my first and middle name, and 808 is the area code of Hawaii, the telephone area code of Hawaii. So Kaylin808, and Hawaii has a special place in my heart, so much because I've been here not only the past 15 years, but it's the place I've most connected with in my entire life of moving around. My parents were both in the United States Air Force, so I moved around a lot, but this place always speaks to my heart. And whenever I'm anywhere else, I just want to be right here in Hawaii. So today, another piece of background about me is that I am a yoga teacher, registered yoga teacher, ERYT 200, and I love anatomy and physiology. I did courses in anatomy and physiology in college, and I was pre-med when I decided I didn't want to become a doctor. I went and studied cell and molecular biology for my master's, and then a business degree as well. But throughout the whole time, I've had a passion for anatomy and physiology since middle school. So luckily, I became a yoga teacher in 2013, and I was able to teach yoga teacher trainings, and I led the anatomy trainings a bunch of times, and each time you teach something, if you know, you just learn and grow so much more. And I've taken several anatomy workshops pertaining to yoga teachers and body movement professionals. So I'm so grateful to share with you anatomy alignment tips and techniques, especially when it comes to being upside down. But today we're talking more about hips. Coming up this coming Monday, Holy Hips, hashtag Holy Hips, as you see on screen. We're working on hip opening and hip strengthening. So the body is a whole and it all works together, but today I'll kind of try to isolate talking about the hips. We'll talk about the different types of movement, the different planes of movement of the body, number one. Number two, we'll talk about the ranges of motion of movement for your hips in particular. It's such a fascinating, mobile, but also very strong and stationary joint made for running away from predators back in the day, a long time ago, right? Our shoulders are made more for picking things off of trees, so they're less stable. But our hips are mobile and stable, which makes them fascinating. You can strengthen them incredibly and enhance the flexibility also. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about the 4 different types of postures pertaining to the positioning of your hips. You can place postures in different groups based on if you're balancing on your arms, if you're opening your shoulders, if you're opening your hips, on lots of different things. But today I'll talk about the 4 groups of postures pertaining to the way your hips are oriented, which is a fascinating way to look at all the postures because you can group them all into these 4 different categories. So number 1, the planes of movement of your body. You have 3 planes of movement, and the first of which is in the sagittal plane, which is this way. It cuts your body straight through the top like this. So as pertaining to life, it's walking. That's how I walk. And in yoga, you can think about Tadasana, mountain pose, moving in that direction. Uttanasana, forward fold, back to a halfway lift. That's all in your sagittal plane. That is the plane I like to get in my classes into the first movement because that's the biggest movement that we use in our everyday life. Walking, moving in a forward direction, or sitting, doing things, sitting at a desk, etc. So the second plane of movement is your frontal plane. It goes like this. It breaks the body front and back like that. So it's moving in this direction. And you can think of this in life. Since you're a yogi, you're probably doing some stretching, or if you have to reach for something over here, etc., you're moving in that plane, or for some reason you're walking side to side like so. So in yoga, you can think of it as in Warrior 2, arms out nice and wide, gazing, or if you're thinking about Paschimottanasana, a nice forward fold. There. The last plane of motion is your transverse plane. So this is kind of a 3-dimensional plane. It is the least used in our everyday adult lives, and that is postures like twisting, or it's postures like Warrior 2. You got this leg going out, transverse plane. And This movement is used so much less in everyday life, but when we practice this in yoga, everything we do on our mat is meant to translate into our lives. So when we practice this in yoga, when we're in the car, for example, and it's not on, we're parked, right? We're not doing anything dangerous, but you need to reach for something in your purse in the back seat, your bag, whatever it is. And you reach to grab it, something a little heavy, and you can bring it forward without hurting your back, because your twisting postures are building your obliques, are building the muscles that surround your spine to support and protect your back, so you don't pull things when you're moving through everyday life, right? Fabulous. So those are the three planes of movement. We have sagittal, we have frontal, and we have transverse, a warrior two, or think of it in a twist, like that. 3 planes of movement. And next, we have the 6 different types of movements in your hips. So we think of strengthening and opening hips. Oftentimes we'll think of just opening this front, your hip flexors, or opening your outer hip in a lizard, right? We think, oh, okay, we're opening your outer hips. Whew, this ground is warm. But there's 6 different planes of movement, so that means we can, hi Lenny girl. Let's say hi to Lenny girl. Come here, Lenny girl. Can you say hi? Hi, big girl. It's hot. Hot, 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 hot. Give Mom a kiss. So we can actually open up our hips in lots of different ways, because if there's 6 different movements, that means on each side we're strengthening or opening, lengthening the opposite side, right? So we have first, we have flexion in this sagittal plane, flexion, knee towards your chest, like so. And then on the same hip we have extension, it's just the opposite, going backwards, yeah? So when you're extending your hip, you're opening up these hip flexors and you're strengthening your glutes and your hamstrings, like so. And when you're flexing, you're strengthening these hip flexors, just the opposite, and you're stretching your glutes, these hip extenders back here. So those are 2 opposing movements. And then we have hip abduction. It's away. Hip abduction away from your midline. Right? And then we have the opposite, adduction. It's adding towards your body. Right? So those are 2 opposing movements as well. You have, when you're abducting, you're strengthening your hip abductors, say in a kind of wide-legged forward fold or a half moon shape. And then when you're pulling in your adductors, or you're actually opening these muscles. So when you go into a frog, you're opening up your adductors, the inside muscles here. And then the opposite, when you're adducting, you're strengthening your adductor muscles, and then you're actually letting go right here. So if you think of in a pigeon pose, right, or eagle pose, you're strengthening the inner muscles, you're adding in, and you're flexing, or you're stretching these muscles, your IT band and those muscles associated with abduction. So those are the second 2. We had the first 2, flexion, extension of your hip, front and back, and then we had abduction away to the outer edge, and then adduction in. And then the last 2 we have are some of the coolest. These are external rotation and internal rotation. External rotation, using your strong glute muscles, your glute max here. And then you have internal rotation, using some of the muscles of your quads, using your internal rotators here. So external rotation, internal rotation. And again, these movements, when you're moving in one direction, when you're externally rotating, you're strengthening these outer hip muscles, you're stretching these inner hip muscles, and the opposite, when you're going into, again, something like an eagle or a cow face pose, you're stretching these muscles and strengthening these inner muscles. So everything opposes one another and facilitates that movement. But those are the those are the 6 types of hip movements that we have. And they're not isolated, they're not one, you're using one so you're necessarily using the opposite. Oftentimes we're synergizing, we're using all of those muscles to create this solid shape. All right, so number 1, we have the planes of movement like we discussed, hip movements, and now we have part 3, the 4 types of postures pertaining to the orientation of your hips. Now, there's neutral. Here is the nomenclature I'll use for it. Neutral is closed, meaning it's in neutral position. It's not externally rotated, it's not internally rotated. Neutral. And I'll put that as you'll hear that as closed or squared a lot in yoga classes. Open is externally rotated, and I'll mark that with an O for externally rotated. Your hips rotating out to the side. And then internally rotated with an I. Okay? So your first type of posture is your neutral posture. Try to leave that there, it keeps falling on me. Okay, so this will look familiar. You have your mountain pose. You have your Uttanasana, hips are squared forward. Inhale, halfway lift. Exhale, high plank, chaturanga. Inhale up. Exhale, downward facing dog. That's all in your neutral part of posture. So you'll often see like a child's pose, tabletop, down dog, sunnays in their first part of class. Now your second type of posture is one hip's neutral, one hip is open. You'll see this in your warrior 2. Okay, this hip is neutral, it's squared. This hip is open, it's externally rotating out to the side in line with your toes. External rotation. You'll see this in your pigeon pose. Okay, this hip's neutral, this hip's externally rotated. The third type of posture is open and open hip. So you'll see this in seated Baddha Konasana. You'll see this in handstand with straddle legs. You'll see that in goddess pose, etc. So the cool thing about naming your postures and foregroups based on the hips, it doesn't matter if you're seated, standing, balancing, or aren't on your feet or on your hands. You can group all the postures according to your hip positioning. Number 4, internally rotated, internally rotated. So you'll see this not as frequently. Cow face pose, both hips are pulling in. Eagle pose, both hips are rotating in. Now I argue in standing eagle, this pose is actually meant the bottom leg. The bottom leg is in neutral alignment as to protect your knee, but if you're doing it in handstand, everything's internally rotated in your hips. The 4 types of postures: neutral, neutral hips, Tadasana, Uttanasana, forward fold, mountain pose. Neutral, open hip. Think warrior 2. Think pigeon. Think half moon. Open, open. So think of goddess pose. Think of straddle splits. Baddha Konasana. Supta Baddha Konasana. And then internally rotated hips. Think eagle, think cow face poses. Less frequently happening there. Last little part I want to talk about is the fact that none of these are absolute. Actually, in your neutral postures, you're kind of working all of these movements of your hips just to come into a really strong alignment. Yeah? So For example, in chair pose, well, chair pose, they're flexed, right? Flexed. But you're also using some of your extenders, your glutes, just to really get a stable posture, right? So these are active, these are active. And you're also slightly externally rotating, but feeling this internal rotation to get this solid state. And then last, you're kind of pulling your legs apart, but also at the same time, adducting, pulling them together, yeah? So the whole time, and especially as you get deeper into your practice, you're using all of these movements simultaneously to different degrees of amplitude to come into a strong foundation. And this is really where I've applied it to my arm balances to get to such a strong state, is being able to apply and use a lot of these movements all at once. So bonus time is Holy Hips, hashtag Holy Hips, coming up on Monday, the 8th, July 8th through the 17th. 10 days of opening, strengthening your hips. And look at the posture list that I have down here in this post, as well as the post I have for Holy Hips. Take those postures, think about the movements, planes of movement we're moving in, the hip movements that we're using in each of the postures, and then you can place the posture into one of these categories. Whether you're a yoga teacher or just want to enhance your practice, I think these are such strong ways to start to get to know your body. And the more you get to know your body, respect it, learn, svadhyaya, self-practice about it, the more it will give back to you in your practice, I guarantee. Aloha nui loa. Any questions, thoughts, please join us, Holy Hips. Coming up, we would really love to play with you, and I'll have tips like this, anatomical alignment cues for you throughout the challenge, so you can grow, work on your practice, while you're just connecting with such a solid, great community of humans on this fabulous, bam, planet. Aloha nui loa, Healing 808. So much love to each and every one of you.